the help of a karakia. Kia tau te rangimarie kia tātou katoa. Kia pai te kaha, ka piki te ora, ka piki te maramatanga. Omi e, hui e, tai ki e. Kia ora, Angela, if you could share the slides, please. Got it. So a little bit of housekeeping. As Angela said at the beginning, the session is being recorded, and we would ask you to keep your cameras and mics off. And when we get to the point of questions, we'll use the meeting chat for that process. We do have quite a lot of content to get through, so hopefully we'll have enough time for those questions. Right, the toolkit. It's designed, next slide, please, Ange. It's designed to help all librarians, whatever their role, be prepared in a world of increasing challenge and division and disinformation. It can be found on the LIANZA website, and it helps you prepare for challenges by providing information on the New Zealand context and identifying the policies and processes libraries should have. There are frequently asked questions and key messages and examples and discussions. This month, we added a new page on event management in response to the increased level of challenge to rainbow story programs in libraries. So if you work in public libraries, you may want to go back and look at this new content. These recent challenges have highlighted that a key and increasing element of challenges to rainbow content and programs is the use of disinformation by the challengers. We've seen channels such as Reality Check Radio and the Family First website promote dubious sources that link drag queen story times to an agenda of normalising paedophilia, and claiming that the Te Mana Whakatu Classification Office decision to maintain Welcome to Sex as unrestricted did not take into consideration the protection of children, when it is very clear from the full decision document available on their website that they did so diligently. Next slide, thanks. So there are two aspects of disinformation we want to address in this session. Our role in debunking disinformation will be covered by our guest speaker, and Marlies and I will talk about the complex balancing act between, on one hand, fighting censorship, and on the other, libraries holding controversial works in our collections that may be harmful to sections of our community. The topic in the case study in the toolkit shown here focuses on disinformation about Māori and how libraries might address their responsibilities to Tiriti principles. But firstly, we're going to hear from someone deeply embroiled in understanding and countering disinformation. Nicole Skewers-Poole from the Disinformation Project. Tēnā koe, Nicole.
Kia ora, thank you for having me. I think just as a scene setter before we sort of move into the specifics of the toolkit, I'm just going to do an overview that sort of puts us on the same page with some shared understandings of terminologies. I know a lot of people will have heard like misinformation, disinformation, malinformation is another fun one sometimes. So I'll take you through our work at the Disinformation Project and outline some key events that have led to the growth of disinformation in Aotearoa and the impacts that it's having on the community and organisations and sectors. Next slide, please. So the Disinformation Project, we are New Zealand's only independent research group, so we are not government funded. We have a mixed funding model and we provide best practice monitoring and consulting on how disinformation is growing and spreading and how we are increasingly see its real world impacts as well as its online impacts. We started in 2020 with a mandate to look at COVID mis and disinformation. In those first few days of and weeks of lockdown, people really understandably kind of went into their phones, went into their laptops, and looked for information about something that was emerging and new and scary. And so the communities that were stood up to share information that we know to be kind of harmful or just outright not true about ways in which you could cure COVID yourself or things like that, they immediately started rolling in unrelated topics that had nothing to do with public health measures and were increasingly more conspiratorial and extreme. And so that meant that our site of study, as researchers, needed to increase its scope. And so very quickly we started looking at the whole landscape of disinformation in Aotearoa. We used open source research, which means that we're in all of the worst places of the internet, but they are all places that technically anyone could be if they'd been sort of watching and following over the last 4 years. And so with that zoomed out lens, we basically, just to fast forward to 2024, because I know we don't have forever today, we basically have 4 years of iterative data on the growth and the spread and kind of key events in disinformation in New Zealand. Next slide. So there's 3 of us. We're a very small team. We bring in extra help when we can and when we need it, but this is our leadership team. Kate Hanna is our founder and director. She's a public health historian and kind of a sociologist, and she looks at the way in which people understand technology and systems. Sanjana is a world leader in studying disinformation and online extremism. He was granted a GIFT CT, like a counterterrorism, tech against counterterrorism PhD grant to look at the use of Twitter in the immediate aftermath of the March 15th shootings. And that, I think, in and itself is a really key indicator of kind of how far we've come, not in a positive way, because that's something that Twitter would never be interested in funding and understanding at this point in time. Sorry. Do you want to go back one, Ange? That's all good. And I'm obviously the Director of Communications, and I work with clients and communities on the organisational impacts of disinformation. So I'm often doing resilience building work around processes and systems to help people who are experiencing huge amounts of disinformation-based targeted harassment to kind of build good systems and protocols to stay resilient, hold the line, and keep doing the important work that people are doing. Next slide. So I'm just going to share some definitions. So disinformation, the kind of current globally accepted academic definition for disinformation sits somewhere in the realm of it being intent-based. So disinformation, as we currently understand it, is the intentional sharing of false information with the objective to disrupt or cause harm or undermine a group or an individual or kind of a perceived group of elites or community or racial group. Misinformation is when people share information that is false, but from a place of genuine belief. So people genuinely believe the bad information that they're sharing, and they're not sharing it necessarily with an intent to harm. We use the term disinformation because, the large scale impact of false information being shared is still harmful. And disinformation actually relies on misinformation and people coming to genuinely believe this stuff as its engine to keep spreading it. So we use that kind of disinformation term to kind of unpack and look at the phenomena. And it also kind of depersonalizes it a little bit, because we know that while there are definitely people that profit from perpetuating disinformation, there are also lots of people who are both kind of victims and perpetrators of disinformation. And so, we would sort of just zoom out at that social phenomena lens. And that leads me to kind of explain that it is, unfortunately, now a phenomenon. It is both a global issue and a local issue. Disinformation is something that all countries are dealing with from various degrees. And New Zealand's kind of disinformation struggles look quite similar to other countries. But we also do have our own unique flavours of disinformation. It is something that is not new as a concept, but is definitely new as a phenomena. So bad information has always existed. People have always used false information, often without context, and shared it to kind of achieve their own ends. And technology has always been a big part of people being able to do that. When the printing press was invented, people printed some real weird stuff. So it's not new as a concept, but it is certainly new in terms of the fact that in the last 4 years we have seen an explosion of disinformation. And there are some real key themes that I will talk about next. But just kind of, the things that we currently understand with 4 years of research kind of globally is that the components are things like unmitigated use of technology. So the technology sector across the board has a growth mindset, which means that they are constantly developing new tools and systems that monetize and basically incentivize people sharing the most kind of polarizing content they can. We know that the algorithm is something that feeds on big emotions, either kind of, big grief, big anger, big happiness sometimes, but unfortunately usually not. And that, spread of the ease with which you can kind of pick up a device and learn stuff that might not be true is a huge component of mis and disinformation. Another factor is that often these themes that we'll talk about in a second play on people's already held kind of biases and bigotries that everybody has. And often disinformation gives people an excuse to keep believing some harmful stuff that they perhaps already believed, and a bit of a community around, other people that share those beliefs. Another component of it is that often we do see very, very clear foreign signatures in New Zealand disinformation spaces. So, we have lots and lots of really good evidence that there are overseas lobby groups that kind of benefit from getting into spaces in other countries and, putting out false information. Next slide, please. Next slide, Ange. Yeah, perfect, thank you. So the themes of disinformation, all of these will probably sound familiar to you by now, but the big one is like a real sense of distrust in government and decision makers and experts. And I just want to say here that historically in Aotearoa, there are many communities that have every reason to distrust the government and decision makers. And this isn't about having a kind of a healthy distrust of people in power, which is something that all societies benefit from and is actually a healthy part of a thriving democracy. This is where people come to believe that, no engagement in public services is acceptable, or any and all experts and scientists are part of a kind of global cover-up that ranges from, in the context of the COVID vaccines, your local nurse or GP right through to the United Nations. And that's a real problem because it gets people to kind of completely disconnect from things that are really important for them to be able to access in terms of public services. We also see that a lot of disinformation is around kind of perceived other groups. So that's, issues around immigration. In New Zealand, we've had a huge spike in a European white supremacist conspiracy theory called the Great Replacement Theory, which is that migrants, non-white, non-Christian migrants will replace white Christians in Western countries. And that is something that I think if you'd said, 5 years ago, would that be something that's huge in New Zealand disinformation spaces or kind of alternative spaces, people would be like, what? No, but it really is a key theme now. We also see huge amounts of anti-Māori rhetoric, anti-co-governance, anti-Three Waters, lots and lots of disinformation around kind of denying that Māori are Indigenous to New Zealand. And, that is something that we saw play out in the prelude to the election last year, where, Māori candidates, particularly Wāhine Māori, were reporting that it was some of the most kind of tense and polarizing and often quite heated and scary kind of campaigning interactions that they'd ever had. And some of these are quite tenured politicians. And so I think, we put out a report called Race and Rage that basically tracked those online rhetorics as having offline impacts. Gender and sexuality is obviously something that I think we'll talk a fair bit about today, and a real key disinformation theme in New Zealand. I would say it would probably be the top at the moment, if not sort of an ongoing sort of near the top issue that we pick up in our sites of study, is the idea that transgender people are a danger to children. This is the same rhetoric that has been used against gay people for decades, particularly against gay men in the 80s and 90s. It is literally the exact same narrative. Kind of pseudoscience studies that link either gay people or trans people to higher rates of pedophilia that we just know are not true. In fact, the inverse is true. Trans people tend to be on the receiving end of being victimized of crime, and yet we've somehow just completely skewed that perspective because of the spread of disinformation. A lot of it comes from the UK and the United States. And as we'll talk about, or as I'm sure Louise and Marlies will talk about later, the banning books theme is a huge one. That's something that I know some of you have already experienced, but in the States that is huge, and I think it's unfortunately coming down the pipeline to Aotearoa pretty fast. Another theme of disinformation is climate change. It doesn't exist apparently, and any and all kind of efforts to be more sustainable or more environmentally friendly, ranging from being able to move through your city using sustainable transport within like sort of 20 minutes, half an hour. All of that stuff has been perceived to be part of a big cover-up that is ultimately seeking to take away people's private property and their rights. And so these are kind of definitely not an exclusive list of themes that we have in New Zealand spaces, but this is usually a snapshot of the kind of the top hits, unfortunately. Next slide. So every single day, our Director of Research does a report looking at the situation in New Zealand. This is just a little snapshot of one day in January this year, where we, looked at different disinformation groups like Sovereign Citizens, anti-Māori racism, people that were polarised around sharing the most extremely violent content that they could from the war in Palestine and Israel. All sorts of stuff. This is just a little snapshot of what we look at every single day. Next slide. And so in New Zealand, we have a really clear timeline of things that have got us to the point that we are at today. I think it's important to say that prior to 2020, we actually did have kind of quite conspiratorial communities that were already showing kind of a willingness to engage in threats and violence. The anti-1080 and some of the kind of anti-MMR vaccine campaigners have a history of some pretty full-on threats. The anti-1080 milk poisoning scandal might kind of resonate in people's minds. So we kind of did already have that basis prior to 2020, but then when COVID happened, as I said earlier, we really saw that shift to people just being kind of on their phones consuming content without a whole lot of critical thought around where it was coming from or why it was coming to them. And so those communities were already formed by August 2020 when, I'm not sure if folks remember, but the Omicron outbreak in Auckland necessitated a shift in our election date for the 2020 election. That momentarily kind of brought us into being closer to the US election cycle. And for some reason, that was the signal that some of our disinformation communities needed, that this was all a cover-up, this was all a kind of globally organized impending totalitarian regime. And so that really catalyzed the sort of anti-government rhetoric and a willingness for sort of what we would consider to be quite extreme ideas being shared. Obviously, then in January 6th, 2021 in America, the Capitol attacks, which was, I think at its heart, it's important to say, like a violent insurrectionist riot, that really did make it into their version of parliament and had lots and lots of plans to pull out politicians and hold them to with trial and execution there on the spot. That, I think, sent some really clear signals that this might be something that was possible to do in New Zealand. And then in September of that same year, a key disinformation influencer decided that the more mainstream social media groups that they were operating in, like Facebook and stuff, had too strict moderation rules, and so they wanted to move to Telegram, which is a app that is basically interconnected kind of group chats that's really easy to just dump content from other places into, and it is completely unrestricted and unmoderated. Theoretically, Telegram has two kind of moderation pillars, which is no child exploitation content and no footage of murder or violence, and neither of those things are enforced, and Telegram is defined by the sharing of a lot of those things. Then the Parliament occupation, which I'll talk about more in a second, happened in February 2022, and I think that showed us just how willing people were to act in a range of ways. Not everyone that was there was violent, but I think it's really important to say that, like, while a lot of people down there had some really valid kind of concerns and fears around losing their jobs because of vaccine mandates and stuff, their bedfellows were card-carrying neo-Nazis and a whole bunch of people who decided to hang nooses in the trees outside of Parliament and call for all of the politicians and all of the reporters to come down and be hung. When Elon Musk bought Twitter in April 2022, which actually he didn't want to buy, and I think that's really funny to think about, is that he decided that he would, kind of went a little bit too public too fast about that, did his due diligence, realized that he actually really didn't want to buy Twitter, but by then had said it publicly, and so he kind of had to follow through with it. And he very, very early on basically rolled back a whole bunch of banned accounts that had been, deleted and stuff for sharing extremist content. He basically said, nah, it's a free-for-all, come back. And that sent a message that this rhetoric that had previously been kept in closed groups or in Telegram channels or in places like 4chan, which was an incredibly kind of awful place on the internet that doesn't exist anymore, a lot of that rhetoric was welcome wholesale on Twitter. When Jacinda Ardern resigned, that also then sent a message to some of our disinformation peddlers that, if you bully someone enough, they will eventually just not have any puff left. And then our general election last year was unfortunately the culmination of a whole bunch of people who'd been looking at ways to disrupt democracy and had various kind of all sorts of ways to basically get people to either not vote because they were led to believe that their vote would not count, or there was a really ridiculous campaign for people to take photos of their voting ballot in the booth, which obviously then immediately voids that ballot because that's our electoral law, and that very well could have been the drive behind getting people to do that. And then since the events in Gaza in October, we have seen more violence in our disinformation sites of study than we've seen even with the war in Ukraine. So those two global conflicts have really shown that New Zealand disinformation spreaders are quite catalyzed around sharing the most violent stuff they can. Next slide. So this graph here is a visual representation of views expressed on social media platforms and our sites of study on the last day of the Parliament occupation. So that was the day that the police came in, cleared out the protesters, and the police were violent, the protesters were violent, there were fires started, someone tried to drive a car into a line of riot police, all sorts of stuff. The pink and orange nodes and clusters on the left there represent people who were consuming mainstream media sources and expressing views of like horror and shock and negative emotions about what they were seeing on the ground at Parliament. The blue and green nodes and clusters represent people who were consuming non-mainstream media, so alternative sources, often disinformation sources of media, and live streams like from people on the ground as part of I've just had a message saying someone can't see the graph, so hopefully can you just thumbs up, Louise, if you can see the graph? Okay, all right, it might just be on their end. But so that blue side was basically people who were expressing positive sentiments about what they were seeing from live streamers on the ground and kind of alternative sources of media there. I think this is a really powerful visual representation of what we now consider to be a splintered reality in Aotearoa. So we know that most people in New Zealand do not think that what happened on the ground at Parliament was okay. But yet these kind of two sizes of views expressed are very similar in size. And so one of the things that we see being quite powerful about disinformation is the ability to use technology to amplify your volume, to seem bigger, to seem like there are more of you than there are, to use AI and bots to sort of, have hundreds of people coming and going, yeah, to something that you've said when those people might not be real. And I also think critically, there's absolutely no meeting in the middle between these two groups. So if you combine orange and that kind of teal, you get this kind of muddy dark green, and there's not a lot of that color in this graph, is there? And so we really see this as being a visual representation of the polarization of New Zealand at the moment, and that was in 2022, and unfortunately that's only kind of entrenched and embedded since then. Next slide. So I'll just focus on the kind of social and government sector impacts here, given our audience, but we do see this having impacts across the board on businesses, on big and small organisations, on public services, academic, social charities, all sorts of stuff. It is across the board. If you are doing any kind of social focused or community focused outreach at the moment, if it has any emphasis on Māori or Pacific communities, migrant communities, you will be unfortunately wearing a whole bunch of racist disinformation. If you are advocating for LGBTQ acceptance and celebration, you are absolutely wearing it, as I know that you will all know. If you are in that kind of government or service provision sector, you'll also be wearing it in a sense that there are a lot of communities in New Zealand that believe that we need to hold government and decision makers to account. Which is ultimately like true in the sense that, our decision makers are accountable to us, but the rhetoric that is being used around this is like, people issuing the Deputy Mayor of Hamilton a writ of execution when she was speaking to a public town hall meeting about a 20-minute city and things like that. So that is the way in which the rhetoric has grown from kind of healthy holding people to account to sort of hanging nooses in Parliament and wanting a second Nuremberg trial. What this unfortunately means is that facts and subject matter expertise and data and research has come to be completely meaningless for a lot of disinformation groups, in the sense that they believe all of this is produced by establishment elites that can't be trusted. And so I think that's really important for people to hold, is that you can't myth bust, you can't good information push someone out of a rabbit hole when they've come to believe that the sources of information that you're sharing are not trustworthy in and itself. Next slide. So this has a range of impacts on organisations. A huge one is the reputational impact that comes from even just having perceived controversy around you. New Zealand and our media are not super great at delineating between real controversy and perceived controversy. Something that was really evident in the coverage of the trial of Dr. Susie Wiles, who people might be familiar with, was one of the kind of key educators around COVID safety precautions in New Zealand. Her employer, the University of Auckland, she's claiming that they didn't look after her well enough, considering the amount of death threats and kind of interpersonal danger she encountered through that work. And it's very clear that once she started to be perceived as being controversial, that kind of cloud just followed her for literally no good reason. And I think that means that organizations are more inclined to self-silence because they just want to avoid any perceived controversy. We've seen in the United States, huge brands, huge companies like Target decide that they're no longer going to do Pride celebrations and Pride displays in store, simply because it's just too scary for them. They've got people coming in and pulling down their displays and threatening staff and stuff like that. And that is ultimately probably the right choice for Target staff, but the wrong choice for the environment that then says, oh, actually, if you are scary enough, then we'll kind of self-silence and we'll stop doing that stuff, which is explicitly what they want, in that the conservative influencers in the United States have said, and I quote, "make Pride toxic for brands." And so self-silencing around that stuff is obviously, unfortunately, capitulating to that. And sometimes that means that you alienate all audiences, because if you're not taking a stand for kind of one group who's very clearly wearing it in terms of harassment and bullying, then sometimes you alienate that group who would have been the people that stood behind you in the face of receiving harassment that's based on disinformation. So that's kind of can be quite a messy reputational zone to work in. Internally, the kind of cultural issue that can happen around staff safety is that people who are responsible for dealing with disinformation are often not supported by their own organisations. That can be a mixture of people just not understanding that this is unfortunately the new normal in the digital space and in that public engagement space. And it means that people burn out. People feel like they either can't report how bad it really is to their kind of their direct line of support, or if they do, they sometimes just get told, oh, let's just delete our social media channels and not have any social presence or put anything out into the public whatsoever, which is obviously not what we want. And operationally, I think, just to run through this part really quickly, because I think you'll all be pretty familiar with this, but it takes a whole lot of resource to push back against stuff that is not that hard to put out. So, we joke, just to small swear word warning, we talk a lot about the bullshit asymmetry principle, which is that it takes a huge amount more work to push back against bullshit that takes about 3 seconds to put out into the world. And that is a huge drain on resources and sort of that welfare issue around a boiling frog and what we kind of accept as being normal as part of our roles. I said really early on to the organisers when I first joined this call that I think that the toolkit that you're about to talk about is absolutely incredible, but I also think that it is ridiculous that librarians are needing to think about security protocols and kind of in-person operational, hostile reconnaissance stuff, actually. And so, I think it is really important when and how you can in your organizations to take that kind of boiling frog impact of getting really resilient and used to this stuff and just actually sitting with it for a second and going, but I also shouldn't have to, and making sure that you have the support around you to keep doing that. Next slide. So I won't go too deep into this because this is what the toolkit is entirely for, but we do see that there are some really powerful strategic responses to disinformation-based targeting, both internally and external. So, we help at the Disinformation Project, we help our clients do basically really, really robust systems and process reviews and development. And then we also help people kind of do that external public engagement comms piece in a way that is really anchored in values and takes really clear actions based on what your organization is there to do, what your lane is, who your audience is, and who your audience isn't. Actually, I think that's also really important. And we work on basically encouraging people to almost go back to their kaupapa of their work, of their mahi. Why are they there? Why are they doing it? What did they do best? And help people to basically hold fast in that storm that can come when we're doing stuff that we know is important, but is unfortunately in the crosshairs of some people that have gone down the rabbit hole. So I think I think that's probably my last slide. And I'll kind of cap it there. Hopefully, I can answer some questions later on, but I'll hand it over to the rest of the team.
Kia ora, and thank you so much, Nicole. That's that is so good, and as you say, is exactly what we've tried to do in providing the toolkit, is provide those systems and processes to protect people dealing with this. So Marlies and I are now going to cover the issue of controversial content in library collections. So this is a slightly different thing. There is increasing awareness of library items that present controversial opinions and include misinformation or disinformation about the history of Aotearoa and Māori in particular. Some of these were written in the past with a colonial perspective that is now understood to be incomplete and inaccurate. Some are recently published, promoting an ideological perspective harmful to Māori. These items challenge us as librarians as we try to balance commitment to freedom of information and responsibility to being exemplary Te Tiriti o Waitangi partners. The books are in library collections because many libraries try to select all or most books and other items by and about Māori. Given the volume and longevity of collecting, library staff may not even be aware of controversial items in their collections until they're challenged. And publishers and authors may actively promote and campaign for their books to be purchased by libraries, as has been happening with Tross Publishing. Next slide, thanks. Te Tiriti o Waitangi is a guiding document for Aotearoa, and a key principle is that Māori retain rangatiratanga over their resources and taonga. The right of Māori to protect their taonga, including their mātauranga and histories, is asserted through Y262. This is the Waitangi Tribunal report addressing the restoration of tino rangatiratanga, Māori authority and self-determination, of the whānau, hapu and iwi of Aotearoa over our taonga, those things and values which we treasure, both intangible and tangible. And that's from the Waitangi Tribunal Strategic Direction in 2020 on the Waitangi Tribunal's website. Furthermore, there is no even playing field in telling stories and histories. Power and privilege are not evenly distributed. Norms and rules and principles tend to reflect the values of those with power. The deliberate suppression of te reo Māori in the past also served to suppress contemporary accounts by Māori of the history of our country. In order to support the principles of Te Tiriti and Māori rangatiratanga over their mātauranga and histories, libraries need to understand and help address the unequal record of our history. Next slide, thank you. Just as an example of an institution, curation is something that can be used by libraries and other cultural institutions to guide their users to navigate and understand the context of the historic content they hold and exhibit. There was a very dramatic protest at Te Papa last year in response to the exhibition about the Treaty of Waitangi, which showed the Māori version and Hobson's English version, but did not make clear that these were not direct translations of each other. Protesters felt that their concerns about this had not been addressed and therefore resorted to abseiling the atrium and spray painting the exhibit. Te Papa in response have taken this down and committed to redesigning the exhibit. And currently in its place is a temporary video projection showing differences between the Māori and Hobson version, and also providing a 1988 translation into English by Suhu Kāwhuru, which is considered much closer to the understanding of Māori who signed Te Tiriti. So context is key. And now I'm going to hand over to Marlies to look at what libraries can do.
Kia ora, thank you, Louise. Do you want to hit the slide button again, Angie? There should be some picture perfect. So we're going to look at Tross publishing as a case study because it gets a lot of attention and we've heard a lot about it. And they've published a lot of books and a lot of them in our libraries. So Tross tends to publish about Aotearoa early colonial history, amongst other things like the COVID vaccine, New Zealand-China relations, and climate change denial. And their books cover both broad and narrow topics such as Te Tiriti o Waitangi, treaty settlements, Māori colonial history, musket wars, parihaka, gate pa, and all other kinds of things in our history. These books tend to have the central premise that colonisation was a good thing for Māori and that the impacts of colonisation, discrimination and racism of the past has been over-exaggerated. While these books may recount the same series of events, they provide a totally distorted and misleading racist interpretation that bears little resemblance to what actually took place. And that was a quote from historian Vincent O'Malley about Tross books. So initially when I wrote this, I had some quotes from Tross books on this slide, but I decided not to include them in the end, and instead would like to encourage everybody to go look at the books and see for yourselves. They are in most of our libraries after all. We tend to criticise people who challenge books when they haven't read them or they haven't looked through them themselves. So I think that as good critical thinking librarians, it's important that we go look at this material so that we know what's out there and what's being said, so we understand why there's an issue here. We can go to the next slide, Angie. So Tross Publishing and its authors have actively campaigned to get books in libraries, public and school libraries. So here's a series of headlines from One News and from Stuff about the responses to Tross books ending up in school libraries. Different types of libraries have different purposes, and there'll be a variety of approaches as to how a library might make choices on these books in their collections. And the public also views libraries differently, and that will determine if they accept or if they challenge this kind of content in their libraries. So a school book versus a school library versus an academic library having these books, say. Meanwhile, groups who promote social justice, Māori interests, parents, and historical societies have been challenging libraries about holding this kind of content. Cool, next slide. So what are libraries to do in this situation? On one hand, we don't censor or remove material and we advocate for freedom of access to information. But on the other hand, we are information professionals who provide trustworthy information. We strive to have inclusive and diverse collections, which both means that we want a variety of ideas and also means that we don't want to alienate certain groups of people. Our decisions about the collection must balance freedom of information principles and Te Tiriti o Waitangi. A treaty academic from Massey University, John Carberry, he explains that having Tross content and things like this on our shelves has a detrimental effect on Māori to see their history and their culture being represented this way, especially from institutions which are seen as trusted sources of information, which risks further alienating them further from libraries. And as Moana Jackson says, no one's exercise of free speech should make another feel less free. So we'll run through some ideas and share some examples about what other libraries have done. Next slide, thanks, Angie. So there's a number of things that your library can think about doing to strike this balance, and particularly to amplify certain information over others and help you justify the decisions that you make. So as mentioned earlier, think about the broader context of your library, your kaupapa, and its strategic vision, mission, and direction. What about looking at the strategy of the governing body your library sits in, the school or the council? And are there points in your strategy about diverse communities, inclusivity, or supporting Māori outcomes? You could refer to these or use them to inform your own internal policies. You could make decisions to remove or to keep this kind of material, but it's essential that you're able to point to why you've made this decision. For example, we heard from an academic library who chose to remove Tross books on the basis that they didn't meet the teaching aims of the institutions. Your collection policies will stipulate how and what comes into your collections, and your budgets will reflect the amount of scope you have to focus on certain things. For example, does your budget have money set aside for different languages or for locally created content? Policies have a lot of power to determine the direction a collection goes in and what your library is offering to its users. So this is a great starting point to ensure that you have a balanced collection. Check that you have policies and guidelines for weeding and deselection. This will steer you away from the perils of self-censorship and ensure that deselection is done in a professional and justifiable manner. There is a quote about weeding that I really like from the Canadian School Library Association that says, "The weeding process is a planned, systematic, and thoughtful process." And I like this quote because it points to the intention behind weeding and deselection and how you can apply different lenses to that process, an equity lens, for example, and really considering what resources are best suited to our users' needs, especially when we have limited resources. Lots of work about lenses you can apply to weeding has come out of the States and American libraries. So there's some links to those kinds of things in the toolkit if you are interested in looking more into that. I read an example of a library who had weeded titles like this, for example, because they had a guideline in their deselection policy about misleading, false, or inaccurate information. There are lots of ways that you can think about curating your collection to strike this balance. So look at what your ratio is of Tross publication history books to, say, Vincent O'Malley or Anne Salmond history books. Having less copies of books with this kind of harmful content is a great way to amplify other kinds of narratives. One public library, for example, a big network reviewed all of their Tross titles and other such books and chose to remove them from their Māori collections and just have them in their general nonfiction collections. The number of copies of those books was also reduced, and in some instances, they were placed in stack collections. So the books could only be requested rather than a patron coming across it serendipitously on a shelf. Book displays and book lists are also great ways to amplify certain types of information over others. Keep an eye out on what books staff are putting on book stands facing out on the shelves and what books are ending up on displays to ensure that there is good content on there. As librarians, it's our role to be critically assessing the items we choose to display and decide what kind of information we want to highlight and amplify. You can use book lists and recommended titles to also amplify certain voices, authors, books, and narratives over others. Also have a look at what subject headings you're assigning to books like this. Subject headings will guide a patron's information journey and steer them towards items in your collection. If I'm searching New Zealand history, so in the subject headings, how many Tross books am I going to see and where are they going to show up in the list? Consider if there are other subject headings you could be using or removing those books from certain subject headings. There is this notion that libraries are neutral organisations and are places for all and everybody. But I would really challenge everybody to reflect on these concepts and what that is really saying. If libraries are for all, then are they also places for racists and intolerant bigotry? And the response might be different depending on the aims of your organisation. Like the National Library, for example, they have much more scope for that kind of neutrality with their legal deposit obligations. Or you might decide that you want to have those voices for the purposes of research or providing context. After all, racism and bigotry are real phenomena that exist, and it is important to shine a light on those things. So, for example, we've heard from school libraries who have chosen to keep the Tross books in their collection, and they've used them as examples when they're teaching critical thinking, information literacy, or examining referencing. One school library actively went out and purchased Tross books and accessioned them into the collections so they could use them when they taught disinformation and information literacy sessions. And I heard of another library another high school who their media studies department asked the library to keep the Tross books because they also wanted to use them in their classes on mis and disinformation. So these kinds of books can serve as great tools to promote critical thinking and educate young people on different perspectives and evaluating sources of information. Books can be held behind the counter. That enables library staff to have a conversation about the book and the content before handing it over to the requester. It provides a great opportunity to have a conversation about mis and disinformation and how to recognise it. Staying in the loop with your sector colleagues, both nationally and internationally, is a good way to be aware of the issues that are cropping up around disinformation in library communities. It can help you know common titles that might be in your collection and enable you to keep an eye out for them and know where they are. One public library, for example, had the authors of Tross in their community who influenced the local historical society and took an active approach to promoting the work. The society members wrote reviews on the library's catalogue on the website, promoting Tross publication books, often in a racist way which upset the library patrons. They received a lot of complaints, and based on the impact on their communities and how they ran their services, they chose to remove the Tross books from their collections. So hopefully those ideas and examples have given you some food for thought, and just a reminder that you can always reach out to the Freedom of Information Committee if you'd like any guidance or have any further questions. So I'll hand back to you to wrap us up now, Louise.
Kia ora, thank you so much, Marlies. That's a great discussion about some of the content that's on the toolkit as well. If you want to follow up and read some more on those topics. So we've got just a very small amount of time for questions, and so if you have any questions, if you could start putting them in the chat. And just while you might be doing this, just by chance, I was with my mother yesterday, who has dual citizenship with the USA, and she received an email alert yesterday because if you are a US citizen overseas, you get alerts when they have some degree of caution. So there's a worldwide caution, in other words, going to all American citizens around the entire world, saying due to the potential for terrorist attacks, demonstrations, or violent actions against US citizens and interests, the Department of State advises US citizens overseas to exercise increased caution. The Department of State is aware of the increased potential for foreign terrorist organization-inspired violence against LGBTQI+ persons and events, and advises US citizens overseas to exercise increased caution. US citizens should stay alert in locations frequented by tourists, including pride celebrations and venues frequented by LGBTQI+ persons. And the timing of this is around, particularly in the United States, their pride events are celebrated in June, so coming up to that. But that I was quite shocked to read that and to understand that that's sort of recognised as that at a global level, that there are people with intent to violence against LGBTIQ people. So yeah, I thought I'd share that with you. We do have a question. Thank you, Lorinda. Nicole mentioned that New Zealand has its own unique flavour of disinformation. Obviously, some of this revolves around Te Tiriti and Māori. Are there any other areas, topics of disinformation that are more prominent in New Zealand than overseas?
Kia ora, good question. I would say that the environmental disinformation around 1080 is very unique to New Zealand as well. That's another key one. 1080 is quite unique in that it only poisons mammals and New Zealand doesn't have any native mammals, with the exception of the bat, by the way, which is often forgotten and very important. But it is, uniquely kind of almost designed for an environment like New Zealand. It was actually, I think it's an American invention, but when we are mostly trying to protect our manu, our birds, being able to use a poison that does not target birds, but instead targets things like possums and ferrets and stuff like that, has, obviously found a pretty large user base in New Zealand. And so from its inception, we've had anti-1080 kind of disinformation based stuff. Some of it is it's not as clear as disinformation. It is obviously a poison, and there are absolutely instances of livestock and stuff like that accidentally having some, but I would say that at this point that kind of anti kind of 1080 poison kind of focused people have really found their family in the anti-vax community, and so that kind of has almost conglomerated what was a previously small but loud group of activists unique to New Zealand.
Got it, Nicole. Our next question from David. Thanks, folks. Are there any online tools? Whoops, I'm just having to scroll back up. You recommend for patrons to fact check content? Marlies, I'm just trying to remember, do we have any links to those in the toolkit? That could be a really good addition if we don't.
Yeah, kia ora, David. Thanks for the question. No, we don't, but that's definitely something we could and should be looking into. Do you have anything, Nicole, that you would suggest for fact checking?
Yes and no. There's lots out there, actually. There are some universities that would do kind of dedicated fact-checking hubs, but there's nothing that floats to mind at the moment. A lot of those are struggling for funding at the moment in this environment. So, yeah.
There are some tools I remember when we were researching the toolkit. So I think it is a good thing for us to look at it and expand. And there is I think there's an IFLA poster about helping you determine fake news, for instance. So yeah, we'll certainly have a look at that. We've got one more, which is probably more a comment than a question. I am a South African citizen now living in New Zealand. When I was a school librarian in rural Waikato, I met the man from Tross Publishing and he sold me 2 books. I read them and was not happy with the racist rhetoric and alerted LIANZA about my concerns. Many librarians told me I was overreacting, so I pulled back. Being a new immigrant, I was vindicated when others heard my call and really started looking at the messages published by them. So thanks for sharing your experience there. I think what we have been trying to say to people is that in protecting freedom of information, libraries still have to choose what items are in their collection, and as long as you're adhering to your policies and your values and your stated mission in providing information, then you are able to not have everything that someone wants you to have in your library. We've just finished our time here, so I do want to thank you again very much, Nicole, for coming along and talking about your work. I would encourage people to go and look at the website. There's a lot of really good resources there. And ngā mihi as well to you, Marlies. And ngā mihi nui to all of you for your interest in this topic. And I'll close our session with a karakia. Unuhia, unuhia, unuhia mai te urutapa nui. Kia wātia, kia mama, te nako, te tinana, te hinana ro, I te ara takatu. Koiara e rongo e whakairea ake ki runga he tina. Homi e, hui e, taiki e. Ngā mihi, ka kite anō.